The champagne glass shattered against the hardwood floor of the country club ballroom, and 200 guests turned to stare at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. My mother's voice cut through the sudden silence, sharp and cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. "Everyone, I think it's time my daughter finally learned her place in this family." I stood there in the blue dress I'd bought specifically for their 40th anniversary, my hands trembling, my father refusing to meet my eyes, and 40 years of feeling like an afterthought crystallized into one unbearable moment. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that in exactly 6 weeks, I would be the one standing at a podium, and every single person in that room would understand exactly what kind of daughter I really was. My name is Claire Dawson, and I was 43 years old when my parents humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered to them. To understand why that champagne glass fell from my hand, you have to understand what it felt like growing up as the shadow in a family built entirely around my younger brother, Ryan. I was the responsible one. The quiet one. The one who got straight A's and never caused trouble, while Ryan crashed 2 cars, dropped out of college twice, and still somehow became the golden child my parents bragged about at every dinner party. I used to tell myself it was because he was younger, that maybe things would even out eventually. They never did. By the time I was 30, I'd built a successful marketing consultancy from nothing, married a good man named David, and raised 2 kids who were kind and hardworking. Ryan, meanwhile, had gone through 4 jobs, 2 failed businesses funded by my parents' retirement savings, and a divorce that left him living in their basement at 36 years old. And somehow, at every family gathering, I was still the disappointment. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about cartoon villains. My father, Robert, spent 30 years as a foreman at a manufacturing plant, breaking his back to give us a life he never had. My mother, Linda, raised us while working part-time at a dental office, and she carried a kind of quiet exhaustion that I only understood once I became a mother myself. They weren't monsters. They were just people who, somewhere along the way, decided that Ryan needed protecting and I needed toughening up. And that decision, repeated 1,000 small times across 4 decades, had worn a groove into my heart that never quite healed. Still, when they started planning their 40th anniversary party, I threw myself into it. I organized the venue. I coordinated with the caterer. I spent $11,000 of my own money on decorations, a live band, and a custom cake because my mother mentioned once, almost in passing, that she'd always wanted something like the wedding she never got to have. I did all of this quietly, without asking for credit, because some small, hopeful part of me still believed that if I gave enough, eventually I'd be seen. The night of the party, I arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. String lights glowed across the ballroom ceiling. The band was warming up. My mother looked radiant in a champagne-colored gown, and for a moment, watching her laugh with her sister near the entrance, I felt something like pride swell in my chest. This was going to be a good night. I could feel it. Then Ryan walked in with his new girlfriend, a woman named Tasha he'd been dating for exactly 3 months, and my mother's entire face transformed into something I hadn't seen directed at me in years, pure, unfiltered joy. I told myself not to keep score. I told myself this was their night, not a referendum on who they loved more. But then the toasts began. My father stood at the microphone, his hand shaking slightly with emotion, and thanked everyone for coming. He talked about 40 years of marriage, of raising 2 children he was, in his words, endlessly proud of. He mentioned Ryan's resilience, his entrepreneurial spirit, how proud they were that he'd found love again after his divorce. He talked for almost 4 minutes about Ryan. Then he turned toward me, smiled, and said, "And of course, Claire helped put this party together. Thanks, sweetheart." That was it. $11,000, 3 months of planning, countless phone calls with vendors, reduced to a single sentence sandwiched between toasts to my brother. I told myself to let it go. I smiled. I clapped. I even hugged my father afterward and told him it was a beautiful speech, because that's what I'd been trained to do for 43 years, swallow the hurt and keep the peace. It was my mother who broke me. Later that evening, during the toasts from guests, my Aunt Deborah, my mother's sister, a woman who never had children of her own and had always doted on me, stood up with her glass raised and said, "I just want to say how proud I am of Claire. Watching her build her business, raise those beautiful kids, and still find time to throw a party like this for you too. Linda, Robert, you raised an incredible daughter." The room applauded. And that's when my mother, glowing with champagne and 40 years of resentment I never fully understood, laughed, actually laughed, and said, loud enough for the microphone to catch it, "Well, someone has to be the responsible one. God knows Ryan needed all our attention growing up. Claire just figured herself out. We never had to worry about her." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has gone wrong but isn't sure exactly what. Then she added the line that shattered me. "Everyone, I think it's time my daughter finally learned her place in this family." She said it with a smile, like it was a joke, like it was affectionate. But I heard what was underneath it. 43 years of being the background character in my own family story, and my mother had just confirmed, in front of 200 witnesses, that this had never been an accident. It had been a choice. My hand went numb. The champagne glass slipped and shattered against the hardwood floor. David, my husband, stood up immediately, his jaw tight with an anger I rarely saw in him. My teenage daughter, Emma, grabbed my arm. But I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply looked at my mother, and something inside me went very, very still and very, very clear. "Thank you for that clarity, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I think I finally understand my place too." I walked out of that ballroom without another word, and I didn't look back to see their faces. For 3 days afterward, I barely spoke. David wanted me to call a family therapist. My best friend, Monica, wanted me to write my mother a scorched earth text message and never speak to her again. But I didn't either. Instead, I sat in my home office late one night, staring at old photographs, old emails, old financial records I'd kept from years of quietly helping my parents without them ever fully acknowledging it, and a plan began forming in my mind. Not one born from rage, but from something colder and more deliberate. Because here's what nobody in that ballroom knew, what I'd never told my parents, or even David in full detail. For the past 6 years, I had been the one keeping my family financially afloat. When my father's plant reduced his pension in a corporate restructuring 5 years ago, I was the one who quietly covered the difference every month through an automatic transfer he thought was some kind of supplemental retirement benefit. When Ryan's second failed business left my parents $22,000 in debt to a private lender, I was the one who paid it off, using a shell arrangement through my consulting firm so it would look like a business write-off rather than a rescue. When my mother needed a hip replacement 2 years ago and their insurance left a gap, I quietly filled it. I did all of this without asking for recognition, because deep down, some wounded part of me hoped that if I gave enough, eventually they would see me the way they saw Ryan. That night in my office, I finally admitted something to myself. They were never going to see me that way. Not because I hadn't given enough, but because in their minds, my competence had become invisible precisely because it never caused them worry. Ryan's chaos demanded attention. My reliability had become something they simply expected, like oxygen, and never thought to thank me for breathing it into their lives. So I made a decision. Not to punish them out of cruelty, but to finally, after 43 years, make my contributions impossible to ignore and let the truth do what a lifetime of quiet sacrifice never could. The first thing I did was stop the automatic transfers. Not out of spite, but because I needed clarity, and I needed my parents to understand, gently but unmistakably, exactly what their financial reality actually looked like without my invisible hand smoothing every rough edge. The second thing I did was call my Aunt Deborah. Deborah had always been different from my mother, warmer, more curious about who I actually was rather than who I was supposed to be. Over coffee, I told her everything. The anniversary party. The years of quiet financial support. The slow, grinding erosion of feeling like a permanent afterthought in my own family. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Claire," she said, "your mother has spent so many years managing Ryan's chaos that she forgot how to actually see the daughter who never needed managing. That's not an excuse. It's just what I've watched happen for a decade. But sweetheart, if you're thinking about walking away entirely, I understand. Just promise me you won't do anything you'll regret." "I'm not planning revenge, Deborah," I told her. And at that point, I genuinely believed it. I just need them to understand the truth. But truth, I would learn, has a way of becoming its own kind of justice. 3 weeks after the anniversary party, my father called me. His voice sounded strange, tight, almost frightened. "Claire, there's something wrong with the account. The mortgage payment didn't go through, and I got a call from someone about a supplemental benefit that apparently doesn't exist." I don't understand what's happening. I felt my heart pound, but I kept my voice calm. "What account, Dad?" He explained, stumbling over details, clearly confused and increasingly panicked, about a payment that had been coming in every month for years that he'd simply assumed was part of his pension restructuring. Now it was gone, and their monthly budget, one that had never actually balanced on its own, was collapsing. This was the moment. I could have told him everything right then. Instead, I said, "That's strange, Dad. Have you talked to Mom about your actual retirement numbers? Maybe it's worth sitting down and really looking at where the money's been coming from." I know how that sounds. I know it sounds calculated, maybe even a little cruel. But understand, I wasn't lying to him. I wasn't manipulating numbers or creating false hardship. I was simply, for the first time in 6 years, allowing my parents to see their actual financial reality without my invisible subsidies smoothing everything over. The truth was going to reveal itself. I just stopped being the one hiding it. 2 weeks later, my mother called, and her voice had none of the icy confidence from the anniversary party. "Claire, your father, and I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" When I arrived, the kitchen table was covered in bank statements and bills, my father's face gray with a kind of exhaustion I'd never seen on him before. My mother looked smaller somehow, the ballroom version of her, glowing, cutting, certain, completely absent. "We don't understand what happened," my mother said. "The numbers don't add up. Your father's pension, the medical bills from my surgery, Ryan's old loan, none of it makes sense with what we thought we had." This was it. The moment I'd been circling for weeks without fully admitting where it was leading. "I think I can explain some of that," I said quietly, and I told them everything. The pension supplement. The private loan payoff. The insurance gap on my mother's surgery. 6 years of quiet, invisible support that had allowed them to live comfortably without ever knowing how close to the edge they actually were. My father's face went through something I can only describe as a slow collapse, shock, then confusion, then a dawning, horrified understanding. My mother simply stared at me, her mouth slightly open, and for the first time in my adult life, I watched her be speechless. "Why didn't you tell us?" my father finally asked, his voice cracking. "Because every time I did something for this family, it disappeared," I said. It got absorbed into the story of Ryan needing help, or into some vague sense that things were working out. "I didn't tell you because I stopped believing you would actually see it, even if I did." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought this might be the turning point, the moment 40 years of imbalance finally corrected itself. But then she said something that revealed just how deep the pattern really ran. "Well, why did you stop now? Why would you do this to us, Claire, right when we're struggling?" Even in that moment, confronted with 6 years of evidence of my quiet devotion, her first instinct was still to make herself the victim of my actions rather than reckon with the years of her own. I felt something inside me finally, fully break free. "I didn't do anything to you, Mom," I said, standing up. "I stopped doing something for you. There's a difference. And maybe it's time this family understood that difference too." I left the house that day without resolution, without the reconciliation I think some small part of me still hoped for. But something had shifted, and I could feel it in the weeks that followed. Ryan called me 2 days later, and his voice had none of its usual breezy confidence. Claire, Mom told me what you did. What you'd been doing. I had no idea. Would it have mattered if you did? I asked, and I regretted the bitterness in my voice even as I said it. There was a long pause. Honestly? I don't know. I think I got so used to being the one everyone worried about that I never really thought about what that meant for you. I'm not saying that to excuse it. I'm saying it because I think I need to actually look at that. It was the most self-aware thing my brother had said to me in 15 years, and it caught me completely off guard. What followed over the next month was not a magical family reconciliation, because real families don't work that way, and I refuse to pretend this story ends with a Hallmark movie hug that erases 40 years of pain in a single scene. What followed was harder, slower, and far more honest. My parents had to sit down with a financial advisor and face, for the first time, the actual shape of their retirement. It wasn't catastrophic. My father still had his pension, they still had the house, and with some adjustments, they'd be fine. But fine required budgeting, required my mother going back to part-time work at the dental office she'd retired from 3 years earlier, required Ryan finally actually contributing rent for the basement he'd been living in for 2 years instead of my parents quietly absorbing the cost. And it required something else too, something I hadn't fully planned, but that emerged naturally from the wreckage of that anniversary party. My father asked to meet me for coffee, alone, without my mother. We sat in a small diner near his old plant, and he looked older than I remembered, the fluorescent light unkind to the lines around his eyes. Claire, he said, I've been thinking a lot about that toast. About the anniversary. About? A lot of things, honestly. Okay, I said carefully. I don't think your mother and I ever sat down and decided to treat you differently than Ryan. I think it just happened, one small decision at a time, until it became a pattern we didn't even notice anymore. That doesn't make it okay. I just want you to know it wasn't some plan we made. It was neglect, but it wasn't intentional cruelty. I thought about that for a long moment. Dad, I think that might actually be worse. If you'd meant to hurt me, at least there'd be a reason. Instead, I spent my whole life feeling invisible for no reason at all, other than I never gave you a reason to look. My father's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father cry. I'm sorry, Claire. I don't know how to fix 40 years, but I want to try if you'll let me. I didn't forgive him completely in that diner. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a single moment. It's a practice, something you choose again and again, sometimes daily, especially with people who hurt you not through malice, but through the slow accumulation of not paying attention. But I told him I was willing to try too, and that felt like enough for that particular Tuesday afternoon. My mother was harder. It took 2 more months, a canceled Thanksgiving where I simply didn't show up for the first time in my adult life, and a difficult conversation mediated, surprisingly, by Aunt Deborah, before my mother finally said the words I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. I did make you feel like you didn't matter as much as your brother, she said, sitting across from me in Deborah's living room, her hands twisted together in her lap. I told myself I was just being practical, that you didn't need the same attention because you were strong. But I think what I actually did was punish you for being strong, and I rewarded Ryan for being fragile. That's not fair, and it's not something I can undo. But I see it now, Claire. I finally see it. I didn't need grand gestures or dramatic legal battles or public humiliation to find my justice, because my justice had never been about hurting them the way they'd hurt me. It had simply been about being seen, about the truth of my contributions, my character, my worth finally becoming impossible to ignore. And once that truth was undeniable, once 6 years of quiet sacrifice stood in stark contrast to a single dismissive sentence at a podium, the imbalance corrected itself, not through cruelty, but through honesty finally being allowed into a family that had spent decades avoiding it. 6 weeks after the anniversary party, at a much smaller gathering, just family, in my parents' backyard, to celebrate my father's early retirement package finally coming through after the financial restructuring. My mother stood up with a glass of lemonade instead of champagne this time, and asked to say something. I want to make a toast, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Not to 40 years of marriage this time, but to my daughter, Claire, who spent years holding this family together in ways none of us ever properly thanked her for. I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm not wrong about this. She's the reason we're all still standing here today. It wasn't a grand cinematic redemption. There was no swelling music, no perfect ending where every wound instantly healed. My relationship with my parents remains, to this day, something I navigate carefully, something built now on honesty rather than obligation, on actual seeing rather than assumed roles we'd all been playing since childhood. But that evening, in that backyard, as my father squeezed my hand and my mother's eyes met mine with something that finally looked like genuine recognition, I understood that the revenge I'd been quietly planning in my office that dark night after the anniversary party had never really needed grand gestures or public humiliation to succeed. It had simply needed the truth to finally have room to breathe in a family that had spent 40 years keeping it carefully, quietly buried. And sometimes I've learned that's the only justice that actually matters, not making people suffer for what they did to you, but making them finally, truly see you, even if it takes them 43 years and a shattered champagne glass to get there.